And it's so good to be here with you today. How are you?
Doing well. How are you, Allie?
I'm good. So obviously we are in the construction group together, and I am excited to get to talk about kind of our involvement with the energy group, and what we do, and how our work ties in to the work that our energy partners are doing.
One of the great things about working at a firm like Troutman Pepper is the large energy group that we get to work with. From the construction side, we get to work with a number of different groups. Energy, there's a great synergy there because there's a great deal of complexity in the transactions. There's a similarity of transactions, but they are, of course, different. You might have a build transfer agreement, you might have a PPA, you might have some other transaction that you're trying to do in the energy context. And I think that we are able to lend some of our expertise to that, which is always an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think that it's definitely something that is unique to our practice that I've really enjoyed seeing is how we can utilize our skills and knowledge from how do we build these projects and what do we need to consider, and take that and work with our energy partners and colleagues to make sure those are implemented in the contracts and that there's a really good synergy and flow between all of the project agreements that might be in place.
One of the aspects that we're always dealing with is how do you allocate risks among the contract parties? Whether you're talking about the utility or developer or supplier, we help to evaluate and mitigate those risks on each project.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there's always all sorts of things to take into consideration when you are trying to mitigate the risks from a contracting perspective. And then obviously we're also trying to neutralize the risks during project development or actual construction of the project itself. And then, on the back end, we're trying to work with these partners who, suppliers or contractors who might be working with our clients on multiple other projects and may, have these established relationships that they really value. And so how are we able to come in as, the legal team and really help to solve the problem so that these parties can continue to work together to develop new projects, and, how do we make those successful both now and in the future?
One of the issues that comes up probably once every 5 years or once every decade is a new technology or a new form of energy generation really takes off. We saw that in the 90s with natural gas sort of took over coal, and then another 10 years later, natural gas came back. And as part of all of that, you saw shocks to the market. Who had the most leverage, who was most in demand, who could supply, who couldn't. And one of the challenges that we face is trying to predict that stuff.
Right, exactly. And, we've obviously seen kind of a newer shock to the market with renewables and clean energy. And so we're really trying to figure out continuing to figure out how do we utilize what we know from the past to move forward and mitigate risks on projects that we don't know as much about with these new technologies or new ways of constructing. It's easy enough to say, well, I can put a solar panel in the ground and generate energy, but it's a lot more difficult if you're not familiar with the geographical conditions or the environmental conditions. And these are things that are sometimes overlooked because you have a contractor experienced in what they do and they are confident that they can do it in other environments, but you really need to, there's a lot more to sit down and think about, I think, before these projects really take off.
Some of the ways we can deal with this are through procurement strategies, making sure that you're vetting these folks out, through agreement revisions to make sure that you're allocating the risks deliberately, and then, of course, through careful dispute resolution on the back end if something doesn't work out exactly as folks planned.
Yeah, absolutely. What we've seen recently in the market is kind of the changes from one type of energy generation to another. And so, that's really come into play as well, I think, within our industry, especially on the forefront of the project as to how are we going to even get this thing started.
Yeah. Well, whenever you're transitioning to a new technology or a new source of energy, really there are growing pains with every one of those projects. I mean, you were telling me about a project where even something as simple as a road wasn't taken into account. That was a unique issue for that particular mode of energy generation. I don't know if maybe you want to try and maybe just give the background on that.
Yeah, one of the things that we see very frequently, obviously, is we're seeing a lot of renewable energy projects come up, whether that's because of governmental incentives or environmental concerns, et cetera. And this is still a fairly new technology. And so you have a limited set of players in the market, and everyone's trying to come together, build these great projects, produce a lot of clean energy. And we're still, I think, figuring out how to do that. There's always growing pains, as you said. And when you have the number of players that we do have, we'll have, maybe there's an owner and there's a supplier of the actual product, and then you have the contractor who's going to be setting up the space to ready the project. And you really need to take into consideration what each contract says and how they play together. Because you can see, at the end of the day, if you haven't properly kind of morphed the terms and obligations of the owner with each of the parties on the other side of the contract, you're really going to have a situation where you could end up with the owner holding the bag at the end of the day, and neither the contractor nor the supplier is able to take any responsibility. And so you have the project owner, and then you might have the supplier and the contractor sitting there pointing their fingers at each other saying it was their fault, but the owner doesn't have any recourse against one because of the other. And so the owner is left at the end of the day just kind of stuck. So you really want to kind of take those factors into consideration when you are, starting out fresh on a new project.
I think in terms of ways that whether you be a developer, whether you be an owner, whether you be a utility, can help manage the risk associated with a new technology or a new form of energy generation, would be through procurement strategies, evaluating who you're working with, ensuring that the team you're working with can perform, that they have vetted out the supply chain, they've thought through who their roster of suppliers and subcontractors are. And that, of course, they have appropriate terms in place with those parties to ensure performance, even if things get tight. Then, along with that, some sort of performance security.
Yeah, which maybe isn't something that they would have thought to have in the past on other projects. But this kind of unique situation might create a time where you do want to consider project security, whether it's, a letter of credit or some type of bond or parent guarantee. But that's definitely, a way that we've seen that our clients have helped to mitigate some risk on the front end.
And there are some traditional means, which is just making sure that some of the key provisions of your contract are tight. Things like force majeure provision. You don't want to have a claim for non-performance of a subcontractor being shoehorned in as a force majeure.
Yeah, and I think another thing that, we've seen really become a prime issue in the dispute side of these transactions is the supplier or the contractor warranties, particularly the supplier warranties. It's important that we take a close look at those before executing any contract so that you understand, what's the performance warranty, what's the workmanship warranty, what is the, is there a repair and replace warranty, and how can you use the warranties provided to really help you down the road. That's definitely a protection that I think deserves more focus than it typically gets.
Especially when you're dealing with a new technology or a new form of energy generation.
Yeah, exactly.
You're having to adjust to that.
Right.
One potential trouble area for clients is rinse and repeat type relationships with supply partners. It is a small,
tight-knit market.
Yeah, it's a tight-knit market with few players, and folks want to work closely together, and there are often trusted partnerships in there. But when you have an agreement form that has worked really well for you since the early 2000s or the 90s, it is valuable to reevaluate that from time to time to ensure that it makes sense with the technology you're working with and also the market conditions you're facing.
Right, exactly. And I think too that sometimes it's a challenge having such a tight-knit market and like a smaller selection of who you can work with. But that can also be used to your advantage no matter what side you're on. And I think that you make a very good point that it's important to kind of consider what you're putting in your contract going forward and not sticking with what you've had for 20 years. And I think that's important for parties on all sides of the deal, particularly when we have, government incentives coming out, and those are obviously all state specific and apply to both owners, contractors, suppliers, et cetera. And so those are very important considerations to think about. Well, Ed, it's been great to be able to just sit down and chat with you today about this. I think it's always helpful to really learn what everyone in our group and the firm is doing and how we can all kind of play a part and really bring value to our clients.
I absolutely agree. Thanks, Allie.